In a world that seems dominated by superpowers, what happens when the next in line decide to team up? Well, today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating alliance between the European Union and India. And trust me, it's about a whole lot more than just trade. Let's get into it. So picture this. It's January 26th in Delhi, India's Republic Day. The sky is just roaring with jets. On the ground, you've got hypersonic missiles and tanks rolling by and this massive show of military might. It's a pure display of national power. But if you look a little closer, right there among all the Indian flags, there's this small group of soldiers flying a totally different banner, the blue and gold stars of the European Union. So what on earth is the EU flag doing at the very heart of India's most patriotic day of the year? That's the mystery we're unpacking today. Here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with why this partnership is so surprising to begin with. Then we'll look at the superpower squeeze that's pushing them together. We'll dive into the actual trade deal, see why it's more than just money, but also where they still don't agree. And finally, we'll figure out what this whole thing really signals to the rest of the world. Right then, let's tackle that first big question. Why this sudden, very public embrace between two global players that, have always kind of kept each other at arm's length? The guests of honor were none other than the EU's two most senior leaders, and they were there to announce a huge new free trade pact. But what's really interesting here is the catalyst. It seems one of the main drivers was actually former US President Trump's habit of hitting allies with tariffs that really pushed these two to finally get a deal done. And that gets us to the core idea of this whole explainer. This isn't just a simple partnership, it's a strategic move. You could almost call it a runners-up club, forming in a world dominated by giants. Yeah, this quote from Chidik J. Bajpai at Chatham House just nails it. The key phrase here is strategic autonomy. It's all about having the freedom to make your own decisions, to not get pushed around by the bigger players. And both the EU and India feel like that freedom is under threat. And you can see the two sides of that pressure right here. For India, the big squeeze comes from a much more assertive China right in its backyard. For Europe, the pressure is coming from its longtime ally, America. They're both kind of caught in the middle, and this deal is their way of carving out some breathing room for themselves. Okay, so we've got the why. Now let's get into the what. What's actually inside this big trade pact that's got everyone talking? Get ready for this number. Before this deal, if a European company wanted to sell a car in India, it got hit with a staggering 110% tariff. I mean, that literally doubles the price of the car overnight. It made the market almost impossible to compete in. And here's the change. That massive 110% tariff is now set to drop over time all the way down to just 10%. That is a game changer and one of the clearest, most significant wins in this whole agreement. Now, the EU already sends a pretty significant amount of stuff to India. We're talking about 76 billion euros worth of exports every single year. And a deal like this is designed to make that number climb much higher. But, and this is a really important but, we have to keep things in perspective. That $76 billion, as huge as it sounds, is only about 0.4% of the EU's entire economy. So while it's definitely important, this one deal isn't going to totally remake Europe's economy. It's more like a strategic piece in a much bigger global puzzle. And that brings us to another key point. The deal has been called shallow. See, India is really protective of its economy, so they left a lot of the tricky stuff like agriculture completely out of the talks. And there are still huge challenges like what they call non-tariff barriers. That's stuff like mountains of paperwork and customs delays that can leave European products sitting in an Indian port for weeks. And this is exactly why we can't just look at the trade numbers. The real goal here, the big ambition, is to build something much deeper than just an economic agreement. This thing is a multi-layered alliance. So along with the trade stuff, they signed a new security and defense partnership, a huge signal of a higher level of trust. Then there's a plan for skilled migration, which is a real win-win. It connects India's huge young population with an aging Europe that needs workers. And they're even talking about collaborating on cutting-edge research. Every single one of these layers is meant to tie them closer and closer together. Okay, but let's be real. This partnership is not some perfect fairy tale. There are major, fundamental issues where the EU and India just do not see eye to eye. And you can see the two biggest sticking points right here. First, Russia. The EU is hitting Russia with sanctions over the war in Ukraine, but India refuses to give up its decades-long relationship with Moscow. Then you've got the EU's new carbon tax on imports. Brussels says it's about the environment. Delhi says, no way, that's just protectionism with a green label. These are not small disagreements. They're huge.
So, after all that, where does this leave us? Well, even with all the limits and the things they disagree on, the fact that this deal even exists sends a really powerful new message to the rest of the world.
And that, right there, is the bottom line. This whole pact is a declaration. It's the EU and India looking at Washington and Beijing and saying, hey, we're not just pawns on the global chessboard. The runners-up have their own moves to make, and they're finally starting to make them. Which leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about, right? In a world that feels more and more defined by a two-superpower rivalry, could it be that these alliances of runners-up are the ones who will actually end up writing the new rules for the 21st century?